I'm Rita Cevasco. I am with Rooted in Language. As most of you know who know about Rooted in Language, I'm a speech and language therapist, and I work with students who struggle with reading and writing. And what I'm going to share with you today are 5 of our favorite ways to use picture books. And all of these ways are good ideas for all students, not just those who struggle. So the first way that's very important that we want to work on with our students is using picture books to build into using intonation and phrasing when reading. So first of all, I just want to tell you something about phrasing that's very, very important. When we read in phrasing, we use a technique called phrasing where we're kind of putting sentences into their natural chunks of phrases. When we do that, we not only improve comprehension for a listener, but even reading ourselves, we improve our own comprehension. We tend to phrase based on grammatical structure, and grammatical structure and understanding of that is part of what we need to comprehend. So whenever we're using picture books, we are taking this opportunity to have kids work on their phrasing. Picture books just lend themselves to that. They tend to have sentences actually already chunked in phrases, and the lack of words per page help kids build into this ability. But the other thing that is important about intonation is it gives us a lot of cues that are what we call pragmatic language cues. They're cues about how things are said, not just what the actual literal message is, but what the quote meta message is, what's the underlying tone, feeling, and so on. So one of the books I'm going to share with you today is one called You Are Not Small by Christopher Weyand. And what I like about You Are Not Small, in fact, I like all of his books. He has You Are, by the way, not, in parentheses, small. And then I Am Not Scared, and That Is Not Mine. All of those, first of all, give you an interesting conversation about why is not in parentheses? Why do we use parentheses? What's the strategy behind parentheses? What are they called? Sometimes kids have a hard time remembering. Oh, wait, are those called parentheses, apostrophes, quotation marks, or just those things I never can remember? So this is an opportunity for us to really reinforce what some of these structures are that we use when we write, okay? Some of the mechanical structures. But the other thing that happens in picture books is the writer uses italics to help us understand that we are supposed to read with a certain intonation. So he says, I am not small. See, they are just like me, italics. You are big, okay? So you get this kind of use of intonation, which is really important. The other thing the writer does is they use underlines. This writer uses underlines. Why do we underline? What does underlining do for us? How can I use underlining in my own writing? So you are all small. By the way, this is underlined and italicized. And then he says back, you are all big. So we have this idea that italicizing is a cue to emphasize. And if I underline and italicize, now I need kind of a stronger emphasis, right? And then we even increase font size and we use exclamation points. And why do we do that? What is the tone? If I read that and I didn't have pictures of a bear who's looking rather annoyed and frustrated, look at these faces, the pictures are giving us cues to What is the tone? Now, some of you have children who may be on the spectrum who have a difficult time modulating their voices, understanding intonation, and making that connection between the intonation cues and what are the feelings or moods being expressed through that. So this is an advantage of using picture books. We not only give our kids cues about how to read, and we have an opportunity to practice that in a fun way, but we also give them cues they may not understand, and we're giving them information about ways that they can write and what they can do with their writing that would be exciting, okay? So another one that I have that goes with this idea that we can practice intonation and we can practice how writers can use fonts, how we as writers can use fonts if we want to have fun, is the book by B.J. Novak, The Book with No Pictures. So you probably are familiar with this book, but in this book, he uses color and boldness and font size. And my head is made of blueberry pizza. Wait a second, this tiny font? Is this whole book a trick? Can I stop reading, please? No. Okay, and we have what's called an interrogram here. I think it's called an interrogram. My note went off on what this is called. It is called an interrobang. Sorry about that, an interrobang. And the interrobang that tells me no, that I have to both have stress of the exclamation point, but rising intonation, like a question mark would be. And practicing that when I see question marks, my pitch goes up. If I'm at the end of a sentence, my pitch goes down. And if I'm phrasing within a sentence, right? If I'm phrasing within a sentence, I might have my pitch kind of going up in some phrases and down in others, okay? And that's something that we want to practice with our students, okay? Another one that builds into this and kind of is my segue into use number 2. My use number 2, I have my notes here, if you'll forgive me looking around, is a book called Mother Bruce by Ryan Higgins. Mother Bruce. Now, Tracy is the one who introduced me to Mother Bruce, and I think it's hilarious. And one of the things I like about Mother Bruce is there's a lot of sarcasm, and there's a lot of writer's tone, or the writer's tone, which builds into the mood of the passage, okay? And so this one uses a very similar kind of technique where the bear has these little gooselings that keep following him around, okay? And so you have your little gooselings talking, mama, mama, but he was followed. So they're saying, mama, mama, and we know their little voices. And then the narrator says, but he was followed. Bruce was very stern and said things like, go away, and I am not your mother, and also, I liked you better when you were eggs, okay? Now, what is interesting about that is I really had to practice this difference between the narrator's voice and the character's voice. And not just one character's voice, but 3 different character voices. And that is an important skill that even when we write stories, we have to have a sense of that kind of dialogue difference in our own heads. When are we being a narrator? When are we being a character? When I'm reading, where is the character talking? When is a narrator talking? And how do I need to change my voices between that? And picture books can give a lot of cues about the kind of mood we want to express, about the choices the writer makes, these writer style choices. If there is a certain mood, what kinds of words did the writer pick to go with these different moods? right? And the illustrations, again, really can aid our kids in getting that information and knowing how they need to say it to fit what they see. And again, if we have kids who struggle with these social language cues and struggle changing their voices, this can be a really good way to help them as they're learning and as they're reading and as they're writing. And again, we do it with these really fun books, which is great. So that leads me into more about dialogue. So dialogue, using picture books to create dialogue and practice dialogue punctuation. And also build in not only to our work and practice of the mechanics, but also spelling. So to show you that, I'm going to show you some Elephant and Piggy books by Mo Willems. And most of you know these books. The reason I like them is they're funny, even though they look like kids' books, much like Mother Bruce. They have this tendency, because of their humor, to cross all different ages and stages. And sometimes people will say, I pulled out a picture book and my student rolled their eyes at me. And I always say, well, we could learn this through this big, heavy text. And I have an example of big, heavy text. Or we can learn it through this nice little picture book. Which would you rather do? And most of my even teenage, older, more cynical students will say, well, I'd rather use the easy picture book. So I'm like, okay, then let's do it, okay? So what we have here is this page, and I want you to notice the pictures that go with the talking. The birds on my head are in love. And Piggy says, they're lovebirds, okay? So if I wanted to take this text and say, we're going to use this text to practice dialogue punctuation, I know where the dialogue is. It's in these talking bubbles. And I know who's saying it. My talking bubbles are pointing to my characters. And now I can begin to say, well, instead of just saying elephant said and Piggy said, what words might I choose that would express elephant's mood? What is he feeling? You could say, the birds on my head are in love, elephant asked with disgust. Okay, some kind of exasperation or some way to demonstrate exasperation. Okay, and then Piggy answers, they are lovebirds, he gushed. They're lovebirds, Piggy exclaimed. Okay, something that demonstrates joyousness is really what we want out of Piggy at this point, right? And so we have this going on through the whole story, okay? And we have all these facial expressions that need to be read and interpreted and can be written. And as we know, we have a lot about dialogue punctuation. You know, am I going to break? Why would two lovebirds, elephant inquired, make a nest on my head? Okay. Why would two birds, elephant sighed, make a nest on my head? Okay, so we can insert the dialogue tag. The dialogue tag can come before the statement, the dialogue tag can follow it. And all of that has its punctuation rules, which, by the way, we do cover in our Grammar Bugs 4. We work on dialogue punctuation, and that would be a nice thing to use with these Elephant and Piggy books. This other idea about Elephant and Piggy books was given to me by Brandy. She likes to use these picture books when she's working on word form memory. And when she's really working on some structures, some spelling structures that she wants kids to repeat over and over and over again, right? So if I wanted to work on, there's a bird in my head, I might read this with a student who can do the sound, and I might have to help them with head, right? If I was working on IR. Or if I wanted to get head, this EA spelling that sometimes represents the short E sound, that's a nice thing to do with a book like this. as opposed to this EA spelling in ice cream that's making that long E sound. And that's a different kind of word form memory we might need to work on. Suppose you're working on soft C, that's often ends a word CE, and you want to get this really solid and have lots of practice. A picture book, because of its redundancy, will help you read that word over and over again. All throughout this book, Elephant struggles with this decision of whether or not he should share his ice cream. Let's imagine you're working on the word should. There's a spelling trick, right? So as you're reading it, if you're doing copy work in a book like this, over and over and over again, the same few words are used because of the humor of debating back and forth about, should I share my ice cream? Maybe I should share my ice cream. Maybe I shouldn't share my ice cream. Okay. The third use of picture books is we use picture books to demonstrate different literary elements. So I'm going to make this kind of 3, 4, and 5, because the literary elements, I really could have used spelling for 3. I probably should have, but I threw that in there kind of as an extra. We're going to talk about mood and reader perspective, mood and reader perspective. And we're going to talk about personification, and we're going to talk about extended metaphor. Okay, so let's start with actually this mood and character identification. So I like to use books, picture books, that go with either my current events or history lessons. And I have a couple here. One is called Unspoken. It's the one I'm going to talk about the most. But I have another one called The Wagon, and another one called Henry's Freedom Box. And all of these picture books deal with this current topic of racism, our country's history with racism, how we have come to where we are, what is institutionalized racism, how does it come to be, where is our role in this. And what I like about using picture books in this case is it's so easy historically. I find this myself. It's so easy historically to look back on different times in history and kind of have this very removed, lofty view. Like, if I lived then, I would have behaved a certain way. And what we don't really know is we are living now. What would we say 100 years from now, looking at us now? What would we say we would have done? Because our perspective now is so steeped in everything going on around us. But we can look back on history with kind of a distance. And what I like about the book Unspoken is it's wordless. And as you know, I really love wordless books. Wordless books gives you an opportunity to have the reader, the viewer, become the writer of the story. And we actually explore this in the book Trees in the Forest. And I like doing that with kids because they realize that the words of this story come from them. They're in their head. And in this book, there is this situation in which this young girl discovers that someone is hiding in the cornfield. And she, without really knowing this boy, who is a runaway slave, she helps him and hides him. And even her family doesn't know that he is there. And I think it creates a dialogue about risk and how much are we willing to give up, and what people have done and those who chose not to, and why. And also, it gives you some reader perspective from the point of the boy who is frightened and hungry and what that must be like. And I feel like in some ways, I think really well-written books can do that for readers. It definitely expands our view and expands our world. But for kids who are struggling readers, it's harder for them to get to that place with characters because they struggle so much to decode the text that it's hard for them to kind of gain perspective and get feeling with character. And they're really able to do it much more easily in a picture book. So they can do it with an audiobook. So it gives you an opportunity, a picture book gives you an opportunity to engage in oral narration and get that connection to character. And then also audiobooks give you that ability to, through conversation, connect to a character, through listening and then conversation, connect to a character. So I really feel like using books to connect now with then, to support history, to make history more real, to make different contexts alive for the student. I think that's very, very important, and building into our ability to understand a character's perspective is part of what grows us as individuals, to be able to stop and try to understand each other's perspectives. And I think that's just valuable as part of the human experience. So that's what I mean by perspective taking. I think picture books do that in a way that isn't always available in a written story. So then my other thing is personification. So I like to find books that demonstrate personification. This one is called Poetry. And I like it, first of all, because there's poetry in it. And it's always nice when you have these books that have a mix of prose and poetry. I'm reading this mystery series right now, and there is a character who's a poet. And so all throughout these mysteries, there's always poetry woven in. And one of my favorite novels that I read was called Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. And he had a character who was a young girl who was a poet who was writing this Western ballad, this old-fashioned Western ballad. And I just loved that throughout this prose, there was poetry that would mimic what was going on in the prose, okay? And sometimes you can find books like that that are picture books, and poetry is one of those. In this story, a little girl leaves a poem for a tree, and it appears that the tree is leaving poems back for her. And so we have parts of this in which you get a sense that the tree is actually personified, that the tree has human-like qualities, where the tree can actually kind of caress her with its branches, or reach out to her, or appear to whisper to her as the wind goes through the branch, and that the tree is watching her and reading her poetry as she writes it on the sidewalk. And I think that when we talk about something like personification, what's difficult is we see it all the time, but we see it in one line here and one line there. And if you can get a picture book that demonstrates a literary element all throughout the book, then you have a much deeper experience of what that literary element means. And I think that we want to have our eyes open for those kinds of books that help demonstrate different literary elements just in that one book, you know, that will just take one of the literary elements and demonstrate it. So another one is looking for metaphor. And metaphor can be difficult for kids to understand because they understand a comparison of a simile. but metaphors can be more difficult for them to recognize. And so I have the book here, I Got a Family by Melrose Cooper. And what I like about this is that all of these images and metaphors and are linked all together over and over and over again, so that we can talk about this. If I got a Grampy loves me sweet, takes me to Frosty's for a treat. How is treat, getting a treat, like love? And does she mean loves me sweet as in sugar sweet, or loves me sweet that the love is sweet? So because it's all about this treat that's sweet, that is the metaphor for how the grandfather loves her sweet, that is an interesting comparison to keep discussing with kids. I got an uncle loves me wishing. Loves me wishing. What does that mean? He's got a special place for fishing, says he shared it just with me. What does that mean to be loves me wishing, right? That we're hunkered under the tree. I got an auntie loves me teaching. This is one kids will usually get. What does it mean? Like she teaches me, so she loves me. She's helping me. Kids kind of get that. But how about this one? I got a brother loves me hard. Now I had two older brothers, and I grew up in the 60s when people believed that kids should be allowed to beat each other up because that was what made them tough. You know, I know what it means to have a brother who loves me hard, right? There was this idea even that if I'm tough on you, you'll be a little tougher, which by the way didn't work. I'm the biggest wimp in the whole wide world. I'm so oversensitive. It's terrible. But I know what it means to be loved hard. I had an older brother that if I pouted and stuck my lip out, he would grab it and twist it. And that was his way of teaching me, you don't pout. So I would say, that's loving me hard, okay? And a daddy loves me high. So what loves me high is this metaphor for plays with me, who gives me attention. But you kind of have to go through this book to get that that metaphor is there. So I just really like books that give you metaphor after metaphor after metaphor, because by the time I'm done talking to kids about this, they have a sense of how metaphor can come in these different shapes and sizes. And so then I'll end on the metaphor. We use picture books for metaphor, okay? And I'll end on that because the other thing that's hard for kids to understand as a writer, when they're reading and reading another writer's work, or when they are writing themselves, is how to use extended metaphor. So I have one metaphor, but I have taken it for all it's worth in expressing an idea. And so for that, I like this book. It's called A Child of Books. A Child of Books by Jeffers and Winston. And what I like about this is we have all kinds of things happening. The end sheets are done all lists of different books. It's very, I don't know if you can see that very well. It's very pretty. And let me take off the cover here because it's going to fall. But this writer has taken this idea, this metaphor of being a child of books. And it's not only in all of the illustrations where words create the illustrations, but they constantly use the idea of a book to convey every single message is connected to this metaphor of books. So I've sailed across a sea of words. So if I'm talking about books, now I have this metaphor about words. And so Let me just give you another example. And they use illustrations for that metaphor. The words become the road. So all of a sudden I can say, their words led me down a path. So I try to help kids see. We will travel over mountains of make-believe. That fiction can take me on this journey. Make-believe can take me on this journey. And that climbing a mountain is like that journey. So the writer on every single page is making a connection about words and books and how it enriches our lives. And they do it through both this visual metaphor and the choices of words that they use. And so we can lose ourselves in forests of fairy tales. And so everything, and then notice how the trunks are book spines, which I just have to say, I wish I'd thought of that. I love the way you can have this discussion about how this book is one metaphor that's been stretched and woven in all these different directions. And so watch for those kinds of books. They're very enriching. Anytime you have books that help demonstrate story elements like character or setting. If you notice, we did a lot with character and setting, or different elements that build into imagery and mood. All of that is so much more evident in a picture book than it can be in a big novel. And when we work on this in the picture book form, then we can recognize it more easily when we see it in novel form. So I hope you've enjoyed this today. I hope that it's inspired you to go look in the library if one ever opens near you, or maybe your local bookstore will let you in. We want to support all those small bookstores if we can in this time when small businesses are struggling. But go to your neighbor's library, look in your own, go through your picture books and have that in mind. How does this build into intonation? How does this build into phrasing? How does this build into dialogue and dialogue punctuation? How does this help me understand mood? How does it help me understand perspective? How does it help me understand a certain setting? How does it help me relate to life now? How does it help me in my spelling? How does it help me in, did I say dialogue punctuation already? And how can it help me with some of these literary elements that really build into how we interpret text? You know, what we call inferencing comes so much from our ability to understand these more subtle literary elements of imagery and mood and tone and metaphor, all of that, and expression and word choice. And all of those can be appreciated through picture books. So thank you so much for joining. I realized as I was putting my books together that there's probably going to be a part 2 to this series because there's still so much more to share.